Do 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 do. Okay, soundtrack's nominal. You're up. Yeah, you have to come over here to be.
Hi.
So every few years, you'll see in the news something about the Zodiac case, and they'll say, has the Zodiac been identified? Is this person the Zodiac killer? And you'll notice that in almost all of these cases, there'll be a question mark at the end of the headline. If you ever see a question mark on the end of a headline like that, don't waste your time, because not only is it going to be just either the same recycled suspect or the newest suspect on the block,
Hi, Marjorie.
if it's being covered by the mainstream news or news outlets, then it's generally going to be a much lower standard of necessary research on the part of the author. And so for those of us who are interested in a lot of these true crime cases and really dive deep on them, we need a more thorough, a more reliable, and a less sensationally profit-driven. I don't know. Over here somewhere. No. We need a less profit-driven source for our information. So generally, what I'll tell people is that unless you see it on, Department of Justice or FBI.gov, and there's a major press release and there's an update to the Wikipedia page, then no, the Zodiac Killer has not been identified. That will happen within 10 minutes of this case being solved, if it's ever solved. There'll be a press conference that will be Department of Justice, San Francisco Police Department. The FBI would probably be there to support, though their role in the investigation has been relatively limited. And for practical purposes, mostly non-existent. The FBI has offered inputs here and there, but is largely unaffiliated with the case. It's largely a Department of Justice California operation. What I want to talk about today, though, is how, if we can solve the Zodiac case, are there any ways that that can actually be done, and not in the sense that, I found the name of the killer in a cipher, I decoded something, I followed a clue from this letter, or the circumstantial evidence. I'm talking about hard, scientific, factual proof that we know the identity of the Zodiac Killer. I will say this. The Zodiac case is solvable. However, something has to happen before it can actually be solved. We don't presently have the pristine, high-quality DNA profile on Zodiac that we do on some other offenders that we catch in many of these cold cases. Basically, all we have on Zodiac is an erroneous and flawed partial profile from the outside of a stamp, and then some notations about few cells being found on various letters. And some of those letters are authentic Zodiac letters, but whatever cells were found were not enough to evidently build a full DNA profile that we could use for things like investigative genetic genealogy. A lot of times, this is because when those letters arrived at the editorial offices of the Chronicle, the Examiner, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and so forth, they were fumed with a chemical compound called ninhydrin. And ninhydrin is used to develop latent fingerprints on porous surfaces. So if I touch a piece of paper and leave a fingerprint behind, and I fume that piece of paper with ninhydrin, the ninhydrin will react with the amino acids in the oils from the fingerprint. And no, we have to go to over there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Will react with the amino acids in the oils from the fingerprint, and that will develop as a black or dark purple fingerprint on the page. And in doing so, when these letters were received at the editorial offices and fumed with ninhydrin, we destroyed the ability to get DNA from those letters. And so not only do the letters complicate things in that regard, they're also, I'm trying to do something. They're also
Yes, baby.
misdirecting in the sense that they're disconnected from the crimes themselves. Now, I, as a Zodiac Killer researcher, do in fact believe that the author of the, quote, debut of the Zodiac letter sent to the SF Examiner is in fact the shooter from Blue Rock Springs. There's very, very little room for doubt at this point in the modern state of the investigation that the letter writer of the confirmed, authentic early Zodiac communications is in fact the shooter from BRS, the stabber from Berryessa, and the shooter from Presidio. Now, that being said, the best kind of lead that we can get to solve this case should ideally come from a crime scene. You know, most of the time when you see these news articles come out and these little Reddit crazes, and every now and then someone will say, oh, he solved Zodiac. It'll be something like solving a cipher and learning a name that way. It almost never involves ballistics or forensics from a crime scene. So there is a distinct world of difference between the way that true crime communities try to crack these cases and the way that actual scientific criminal investigators successfully crack them when you hear about them in the news. Very, very rarely, or if ever, is a cold case solved by someone's list of circumstantial proofs for this or that suspect. It's usually things like investigative genetic genealogy, or familial DNA matching. It's almost certainly DNA nowadays. DNA is the new way to solve crimes. And so I think that if we're going to have a fighting chance of solving the Zodiac case, it needs to be approached from the standpoint of DNA. And so, with that 7-minute introduction, let's get into, is this a solvable case?
Computer.
To the interface.
So it makes a difference
What you mean?
if you didn't have a microphone.
Oh, way different, yeah. It's like high quality studio sound. All right. So for those of you familiar with the case, this is 29-year-old Paul Stein, the final confirmed victim of the Zodiac Killer. He was murdered on October 11th, 1969, shortly after 10 p.m. on Washington Street and Cherry Street in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. He was a taxi cab driver, and he was killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. This is that crime scene. Now, because the details of what we're going to be talking about today matter a lot, I'm going to expand on this picture a little bit. Now, I tried Googling this. Did the Zodiac Killer ride in the front or the back seat of Paul Stein's cab? Now, I already have a belief on that matter, but I Googled it because I wanted to see what the internet said and if there was anything key or substantial I could just throw into a photograph for you. Unfortunately, I think AI is dead wrong. AI thinks that Zodiac was in the back seat of the cab. I think that even Richard Grinell published a article saying no front seat killer. And, the backseat crowd does have its traction. What I do want to point out, though, is that, and I would need to look this up again and confirm that I'm right, so if anyone needs to fact check me, I'm open to being wrong on this, but as far as I know, the California Department of Justice concluded that the killer of Paul Stein rode in the front seat of the taxi cab. Why? Well, their argument was based mostly on blood spatter, and they said that there was a void of blood spatter in the front passenger side of the cab of the taxi that would indicate that someone was sitting in that position and blocked the back spatter from the contact gunshot wound traveling and spattering on the walls of the cab. I think it's a good point. I've never looked at the blood evidence, and so I don't know for sure. But if you want to take Department of Justice's word for this, there is a blood spatter void in the front seat of the cab. And I think if you look at the inside of that passenger side door right there, it might be too small to tell. And maybe you couldn't, determine this from that photograph or from any of the photographs. But it's possible that that door actually looks pretty clean, and maybe there is more blood spatter throughout the cab.
Therefore, the people who believe that he sat in
We're
the
getting
back
to that.
seat
We're getting to that.
with traction is similar to the pro burgers.
Well, pro burgers are completely insane. He's already pled guilty, so.
I know. So it's insane they think he was in backseat.
Okay. Well, there is reason to. Is that Mr. JSV? There is reason to believe that the killer might have been riding in the back seat, and I can see why Richard Greinell and others think this, because Paul Stine, shortly before his death, he was robbed. Allegedly. The story goes that Paul Stine was robbed by a passenger who sat in the front seat of his taxi cab, and after that time, he never let passengers ride in the front seat of his taxi cab again, and this was relayed to us allegedly by his fiancée and from the people who knew him. I don't know if that information is true, and what I'm going to show you today is going to partially suggest that that rule either wasn't that firm, or for whatever reason, the Zodiac, that rule did not apply to the Zodiac. So let's look at reasons why I really think the killer sat in the front seat of this taxi cab. Is what do you notice about this vehicle right away? There is only one door open on this taxi cab. It is the front passenger side door. We know at Presidio Heights that the Zodiac Killer did not wear gloves in committing this crime. He claims that he put 2 coats of airplane cement all over the surfaces of his fingerprints, and this allowed him to touch surfaces without leaving latent or patent prints. And go to my channel and check out the video Operation Airplane Cement. We cover just how possible or plausible is that claim, and some of the indications that show in the patent print photography that the Zodiac may have, in fact, been putting some kind of obscurant onto his fingerprints, whether that was airplane cement like he claims or some other artifact. What we do know is that we have numerous witnesses to this crime scene. The 2 key witnesses to this crime, or the immediate aftermath of this crime, were Lindsay and Rebecca Robbins, a 14 and 12-year-old kid who were on the 3rd floor of the apartment directly across the street from this cab. So only about 60 feet or whatever, 80 feet from the cab. And that during their observations of this offender's activities at this crime scene, Lindsay Robbins went downstairs and observed the killer through, and this might have been Rebecca. One of them went downstairs and observed the killer through the blinds from inside the dark room of the house, and so the killer had no idea that anyone was watching him, but these kids were watching him. And they confirmed to us that this offender was not wearing gloves. We also receive that confirmation from Patrolman Officer Donald Falk, who was responding to this crime and, in my belief, drove past the Zodiac and made some preliminary observations about him. But his general witness quality has been a matter of some dispute. Either way, we know that the Zodiac did not wear gloves at this crime scene. So, fingerprints would be a concern to him, and fingerprints certainly were a concern to him because he wrote in the bus bomb letter an entire diatribe about how he was accounting for not leaving fingerprints at his crime scenes.
Is that okay?
Yeah. The Zodiac was also observed wiping down parts of this taxi cab with a piece of Paul Stine's shirt. Oh, I have to reframe the phone. Yeah. Okay. Whoa. Okay, so for the Zodiac Killer, it is going to be of the utmost importance to minimize the number of surfaces that he's coming in contact with, touching, etc. Because every surface that he touches is another opportunity to leave a fingerprint sample behind. We know that the Zodiac Killer was, in fact, quite evidence conscious with fingerprints, and we know that in his era, fingerprints were the number one forensic evidence that an offender might deposit. There was no touch DNA. There was no primary DNA type science. And so you had witness reports and you had fingerprints and ballistics. And ballistics even was less advanced then, of course, than it is now. So I do, in fact, believe that the Zodiac sat in the front seat of the cab for two reasons. Until I see, an indicator otherwise, I'm going to take the Department of Justice at their word that the blood spatter evidence shows that there is a man-sized void in that front seat, and I'm also going to supplement that with the logical opinion that Zodiac would have only touched one door of this taxi cab and would have wanted to minimize contact with additional door handles at this crime scene. Therefore, sitting in the front seat, he would open that front seat passenger door, step out of the cab, and then not open any other doors and not close that door, because even closing it is another opportunity to leave fingerprints behind. Okay. So, where are we on Paul Stine's cab then? Well, we have some fingerprint evidence from Paul Stine's cab. We have both latent and patent fingerprints from that crime scene. But the problem is they're extremely poor quality, and the rendering of them that we have as the public is extremely blurry, and you really can't do much with it. I have previously written to the SFPD and lobbied for the SFPD to release higher resolution scans of those fingerprints so that the private sector and independent researchers could begin potentially making fingerprint analyses of those latent and patent prints. But I've received no response from the SFPD, and of course, to my knowledge, no high-resolution scans of those prints has ever been released.
Good job.
Mm-hmm. You, good job. Now,
So how are you gonna solve it?
perfect timing.
I help you.
Yeah, of course. MVAC DNA extraction from fabric upholstery seams. The MVAC DNA extraction process is particularly effective for fabric upholstery seams, as it can collect DNA from porous or rough surfaces that traditional swabbing methods may not reach. The MVAC system works by spraying a sterile collection solution into the fabric and then vacuuming it off, creating a mini hurricane that loosens the DNA material. This method has been proven to be valuable in solving cold cases and expanding the potential evidentiary items that can be collected and tested. For fabric upholstery seams, the MVAC system can effectively recover DNA from various materials, including knotted cotton, woven cotton, gabardine, polyester, silk polyester, nylon, rayon, wool, linen, 95% cotton, 5% spandex, and acetate. The system has shown higher recovery rates for touch DNA compared to traditional swabbing techniques, making it a valuable tool for forensic DNA collection. The MVAC system's ability to collect DNA from fabric upholstery seams is a significant advancement in forensic science, allowing for the recovery of trace DNA that may have been missed by other methods. This technology is particularly useful in cold cases where DNA material from the surface of a piece of evidence was previously collected but still contained trace DNA within the pores. Why do I mention seams? Oops, come on, mouse. I can't really see my own image titles here, so I have to. Humans shed approximately 30,000 to 40,000 dead skin cells every minute, which equates to roughly 1.8 to 2.4 million cells every hour. Over a 24-hour period, this totals nearly 50 million to over 1 million plus cells, depending on the source, with total annual shedding amounting to over a pound of skin. Roughly, most of that information is going to be irrelevant, but just goes to show you how much skin we are constantly shedding in life. Now, make sure I have the right things queued up. The Zodiac Killer was in Paul Stein's cab for approximately 15 minutes on the night of October 11th, 1969. The duration and details of their time together include the following. Stein picked up the passenger, the Zodiac, at the intersection of Mason and Geary Streets in San Francisco's Union Square around 9:45 p.m. Ride distance. The intended destination was the intersection of Washington Street and Maple Streets in Presidio Heights, a trip of roughly 3 miles. For reasons unknown, the cab traveled 1 block past the original destination, coming to a stop at Washington and Cherry Streets, where the murder occurred at approximately 9:55 p.m. After the shooting, witnesses observed the killer remaining in the cab for several minutes to wipe down the interior and remove a piece of Stein's bloodstained shirt before walking away. Note that Zodiac appears to be wiping down the interior of the cab. When Zodiac left this crime scene, and this is going to be contradicted by the crime scene photography, but there's a reason why. What is this? Kid Freshie, I think the main hurdle to solving this is not looking in the right place. You know? And what you're mentioning there with sketches and witness reports and stuff is a component of the wrong place. So the focus has been on that kind of stuff, but that doesn't mean that hope is lost. It's instead, focus should be redirected to more scientific avenues to potentially identify this offender. Okay, so I pulled up this calculator, and what we're going to do here. So the Zodiac Killer shedding approximately 35,000 skin cells hold on. Did I do something wrong here? I think I did. It's okay though. Oh, every minute. Yeah, okay. 35,000 skin cells every minute for 15 minutes. That means in a maximum possible fucking world, Zodiac shed approximately... Oops. Jeez, man. I need to find a way to mount this camera better than this. Terrible. Or a desk. Oh, that good idea, maybe. The dumbest camera design ever. Okay. 525,000 skin cells during a 15-minute cab ride. Immediately, let's just divide that number in half. Let's say he's got a clothing on. Immediately let's divide it in half without even thinking about it. We're going to do more divisions, of course, but just divide it in half. And we still 1,500 skin cells shed during that 15-minute cab ride. Let's divide that by 10 to account for all kinds of other things. Clothing, wind, just whatever you want. Let's just divide it by 10. And we still have 26,250 skin cells shed by the Zodiac during that 15-minute period. Now, just because we can, let's divide that number by 80. Let's say we only find, we only have the potential to find 1/80th of those skin cells. We still have 328 skin cells shed by the Zodiac. And this doesn't include perspiration. We aren't even talking about, sweat, and other natural skin oils. This is just skin cells. We're looking at 328 skin cells in that cap. A DNA profile can be generated from as few as 5 to 10 skin cells, often referred to as touch DNA or trace DNA. Though consistent, high-quality profiles usually require more, 8 to 7 cells can theoretically work. Studies show that successful profiling often requires hundreds to thousands of corneocytes, skin cells collected from surfaces. Remember, we still had 328, even after all those divisions, we still had 328 skin cells, and we're not even talking about, sweat. And I don't think it's being looked for. Forensic techniques have become incredibly sensitive, allowing for profiles to be generated from a very small number of cells, sometimes as low as 5 to 10. Touch DNA variability. A study found that for reliable DNA profiling, more than 4,000 to 8,000 surface skin cells might be required, depending on the collection methods, swab versus tape lift. Now, look, that's not an MVAC. That's a swab or a tape lift. Okay, an MVAC might be much more effective at really sucking up all those skin cells. For a full profile, because what you're having there is skin cells are adhering to surfaces, and so when you run the swab over them or you take a tape lift or whatever, it's not really actually pulling them off the surfaces because for whatever reason. But the MVAC likes to advertise that it's better at that collection because it's using a solvent and then low pressure. For a full profile with high confidence, approximately 100 to 150 cells are often ideal, though far fewer can be sufficient. So, in the Zodiac's era, there was no DNA, and there's been this, or at least there was no DNA profiling used in criminal prosecution. There's been this, what I believe is largely a misconception, that if evidence sits around for too long, then the DNA degrades, or that mixed profiles are hard to work with and can be a contaminant. The reality is science has gotten a lot better, and I think DNA has a pretty long half-life. So if you just spit on a surface or touch a surface, your DNA will be there for a very long time, unless it's wiped off or cleaned off with an agent, something that oxidizes the DNA or dissolves it or whatever. And so with even mild evidence preservation, there should still, in theory, be some skin cells in that cab, and specifically, if you're going to find them, I would say look in the seams of the front seat. Because inside the seat, rather than on its surface, inside the stitching of the seat is probably going to hold skin cells more reliably and possibly more effectively for a much longer period of time. And if that cab is still in storage, then anyway, there should still be some DNA.
On the inside of the seat?
Yeah. Now I'm trying to think. Did I put the Zodiac cabin storage? Here's the cabin storage photograph from the SFPD. Now this is a pretty old photo, so I'm not sure if this still looks like this. What I will say is that if the taxi cab is stored like that in storage at the SFPD, there should be some DNA in the seams of those seats. I do not believe that the DNA under those conditions in skin cells is going to degrade when left to its own devices in that time. It's possible it would. I don't know for sure. But I would look. Just in case. How long can it really take to do that? I had a photo for this. I don't know where it went. Of how many people rode Paul Stein's cab. I thought I saved it. I guess not. See, the problem is AI a lot of times just doesn't know this information, but there's at least one person that rode in the taxi cab before Zodiac that night. But if the rumors are true and that passengers did not ride in the front seat of Paul Stein's except Zodiac, then you might only have those DNA profiles from the backseat of the taxi cab. And in fact, there is some circumstantial evidence to indicate this, because there were gloves found in Paul Stein's cab. There were, I believe, a size 7, like women's gloves that were found in the backseat of that taxi cab. And so it appears that at least one indicator, plus the alleged testimony from Stein's fiance, that passengers did not commonly ride in the front seat of Paul Stein's cab, in which case there's a possibility that the Zodiac was the only person that rode in the front seat of Paul Stein's cab. And the only other possible source of DNA contamination is the positioning of Stein's body. When the Zodiac left the Paul Stein crime scene, Paul Stein's head was on the floorboards of the taxi cab. When Paul Stein's body was photographed by crime scene technicians, Paul Stein was laying on the front seats of the taxi. This is because the emergency responders, medical technicians responding to that crime scene, rolled him back from the floor. They rolled him onto his back and put him onto the seats of the car. And then crime scene photographers came in and took those photographs. And that's why we have a large pool of blood on the floorboard of the passenger seat in the front seat of Stein's cab. But the photos indicate a decedent in the, laying on the chairs. Stein is also wearing a shirt, and his head is hanging out of the taxi. So he's probably not shedding as much skin cells onto, for example, the left side of the passenger seat as someone like Zodiac might have been, had Zodiac been riding in the front seat of that cab. I think that there is possibly few sources of DNA contamination from that cab, and the mixed profile that we might expect to find might only be from 5 or 10 different donors or contributors. And of course, if you can identify 8 or 9 of those donors or contributors, whether that's through testing of the relatives of the responders, or through straight investigative genetic genealogy and just go one by one for each one of those donor profiles. If you can eliminate or identify 9 of those people and you still have one unidentified profile, that might be Zodiac. And then, of course, we'd be talking about how to identify him. In the early days of DNA, you had to have a suspect, and you had to match their DNA. So if I found a DNA profile in a crime scene, I could either find someone's family member and check their DNA against that crime scene sample, or I could match that or test that DNA sample against that person directly and see if we get a match in the profile. Now, that is not required at all. Now, because of websites like gedmatch.com, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, blah, 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 thousands or millions of people all around the United States have been doing buccal swabs on themselves and then sending their DNA in for these companies to build genetic databases of the United States and elsewhere. Some of these databases, such as GEDmatch, are public domain. So the government can go in and basically do whatever they want research-wise with your DNA. Now, for most people, that's not a problem. But if you're the third cousin of the Zodiac Killer or the fourth cousin of the Zodiac Killer, and you've submitted your DNA through these websites, then what can be done is to start building your lineage through obituaries, newspaper, grave sites, census records, birth certificates, etc., by law enforcement. They can go back in time to the generation where you had a common ancestor with the offender. Then they take that common ancestor and then they build his genetic family tree, or his family tree going forward until they arrive at the relevant time period. So in this case, that would be 1969, which one of the males in this family was, living in this area, blah, blah, blah. And then you combine that result with the circumstantial evidence for a suspect. And then finally, after that work is done, DNA is collected from the suspect who has been identified through investigative genetic genealogy, whether that's a surreptitious DNA sample or a direct, hey, swab your mouth and give us, In the case of Joseph D'Angelo, that was 2 surreptitious DNA samples that were used to make that match and confirm that he was, in fact, the donor of the genetic material from the crime scenes. All this being said, is the Zodiac case solvable? I like to tell people, if you're going to attempt to really actually truly solve this case, you need to be looking at Paul Stine's cab. There are a couple of other places that you can also potentially look, such as the bindings from Lake Berryessa, and if you needed to, you could use the letters. And if you get a DNA profile from a confirmed letter, from the inside of a letter or the backside of a stamp, or something like that, then that might qualify as reliable provenance for a DNA profile of the terrorist known as the Zodiac. But I would go from crime scenes, and specifically Paul Stine's cab. And then if we get a DNA profile, it's over overnight. Brian Koberger was identified through investigative genetic genealogy in a matter of days or weeks. I genuinely saw that. Didn't Falk say his suspect was 50 pounds lighter than the Berryessa killer? There's no way to reconcile those two accounts. Well, I mean, people are just... people's assumption of someone's weight is just not all that accurate. Muscle and fat weigh differently, and clothing can play a huge part in how much you think somebody weighs. And so I think the way to reconcile those two things is to accept that both Falk and any other witness reports that you're going to put that against are simply vulnerable to error. What was the sample used to test ALA? Do we still think it is a good sample? Absolutely not. Was it ever a good sample? Absolutely not. Why look for skin cells if we have that sample used to test ALA? Because it was a partial DNA profile from the outside of a stamp. So the envelope had been handled by numerous people, and it wasn't from a location on the envelope that was accessible only to the author or to someone who opened the envelope. And again, that's letter stuff. So yes, I would accept a DNA profile from the debut letter, for example, or from the 3-part letter or the dripping pen or any of these things that contain like the 340 stuff like that. I would accept a DNA profile from those letters, but it's not ideal. And realistically, the DNA is best sourced from a crime scene. Because if it's sourced from a crime scene, we know with 100% certainty that not only is that the Zodiac's DNA, but it is the actual offender who pulled the trigger at that crime scene. It's just more solid than a letter, even though the letters are real. Totally agree that cab is a gold mine. Need to get someone who cares to take over the evidence. I know, it's ridiculous. They won't even look. I've written this to them, by the way. I've written letters to the San Francisco Police Department saying, MVAC that cab. Was the blanket, etc., from Berryessa entered into evidence, or was it all thrown away? I think it's been put in evidence, because I think Dennis Land showed up to that crime scene and he bagged everything up, which you're not supposed to do, but or he threw it all in the back of a truck or something. So are you saying that ALA is not ruled out on DNA? That's exciting. Yes, ALA is not ruled out on DNA. If ALA were ruled out on DNA, I would never consider him as a suspect. DNA, to have a true rule out on DNA is a very, very powerful thing. ALA has always been on the menu. That's the funny thing. The only reason that, and the anti-Allen camp does have at least a couple hurdles that pro-Allen people would need to get around, Now, do I think Allen's a Zodiac? The evidence appears to, or the circumstantial evidence appears to hint very strongly towards that, to the point where I like him as Zodiac better than than any other suspect that's ever come up. The hair, yeah. The hair is that main thing. Which is why, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of wigs and hair again, but you guys know where I stand on that. And I don't think that I don't think Alan has been ruled out. I'll say that. That's the best way for me to say that, is that Alan has just never been ruled out. And there's a lot to look at there. But that's what happens in true crime. People always have a suspect, and then they want to look into the suspect, and they go down that rabbit hole. The rabbit hole that would be better, would be a better use of our time as a community and as a research effort, would be collecting scientific samples from the taxi cab, not obsessing over Arthur Lee Allen for 1,000 years, which is what's been going on. You know, they announced a whole documentary. I don't even want to, but you guys know Allen's. It hasn't solved the case so far. So the DNA collection at least has a chance to solve that case. And Druser told me that they just don't care. They won't do it. It's too much work. They're just not going to do it. So if that's the case, then I guess it's not solvable because nobody cares. But if anyone wanted to know, do we actually have a shot at this thing? That is a very solid. At least go down that avenue, test it out, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Fine, move on. Then go to the bindings at Berryessa. At least try. Because things have been solved in a lot less complicated ways than that. And things have been solved that are more complicated than that, I think. Maybe. Okay. Live from a spinning ball. This has been the most banned prowler online.